Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Welcome to our second JBI Evidence-Based Healthcare Symposium, the JBI Solution Room. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all today. My name is Zachary Munn, and I'm the Director of Transfer Science at the Joanna Briggs Institute, and it's my pleasure to act as a chair of today's proceedings for this event. Now, before we get into this event, I would like to firstly acknowledge that today's event takes place on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people. And I wish to acknowledge the Kaurna people, the original custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and the land on which the University of Adelaide's campuses at North Terrace, Waite, Theberton and Roseworthy are built. Now, I'd also like to thank our major sponsors for today, SA Health, who we have partnered with for today's event and who without which this event would not have been possible. And particularly I'd like to thank Jenny Hurley for all her work in supporting this event as well. So, good morning. We are certainly in for a fantastic event here today in this beautiful building. Now, you have all come here today with questions, problems, and perhaps challenges that you have encountered when trying to get evidence into practice. You are all wanting to get evidence into practice, my kind of people, and we have heard these problems and we can empathise. And I can say to you today that you will hear some solutions to these challenges. Our next speaker for today, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Ian Olver. So Ian has held many roles during his illustrious career as a researcher, oncologist, bioethicist, director, professor, and CEO. And I can't run through them all because we'll get into lunchtime. But some highlights do include Director of Medical Oncology at the RA, Director of the UniSA Cancer Research Institute, Professor of Translation Cancer Research, and the CEO of Cancer Council Australia, where he was involved in innovative approaches to guideline development and implementation. He has published over 200 papers, contributed as an author or editor to over 200 books, and has been appointed to the Order of Australia. It's a real pleasure to have him here today. Now, I've personally had the pleasure of working with Ian on the scientific committee for the Guidelines International Network and JBI conference, which is coming up in Adelaide later this year, which I hope you will all attend. And I've witnessed firsthand, in his role as chair of a scientific committee, perhaps the most incredible and rare ability I've seen that Ian has, which is keeping academics to time and on focus during committee meetings, even over a teleconference, which I thought previously was impossible. So a very talented man. So Ian is a world-renowned expert, and it's our pleasure to have him here today. Please welcome Ian to the stage.
Good. Thanks very much, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here, and I was given the challenge of the topic. We have guidelines, but how can we implement them? In 20 minutes, I thought I'd stick to sort of overviews and things, but I think one of the things we've got to understand is what the barriers to implementation are, why we're not implementing guidelines and other evidence-based research. And in a scoping review that included 69 papers, Fisher made the following observations that guidelines are often produced for common conditions, often conditions that come with a high cost, and where there's a variation in practice. But the important thing is where changes in care can actually make a difference. There's no real benefit to guidelines, I guess, if there's nothing you can do in terms of implementing them. 30 to 40% of patients receive treatment not based on evidence, and that 20 to 25% of patients receive treatment that is not needed or harmful. And so they're fairly alarming figures, and guidelines are part of the mechanism of translating research into practice, and that's why they're important. So there are barriers on several points of view, and one of them is the physician barriers, and some of those barriers are knowledge. There's a lack of awareness or familiarity, and medicine moves fairly quickly, and to a certain extent that's why it gets subspecialised, because you can no longer be an expert across a lot of general fields. And even in a specialty field, in my own field of oncology, we suddenly made a transition from dealing with sort of chemicals to treat cancer to immunological agents, and had to pretty much relearn everything about toxicities, about activity, and so on. And so it's easy to get behind if you're not in an environment of continuing education. But then there's attitudinal barriers as well. One is sort of not being very careful of being aware of your own performance. In other words, if you are slipping, not really recognising that that's the case. And that's a problem that we have sometimes with solo or small practices. Some people have a lack of skills as fields move on. They're not part of a learning culture, so they don't have continuous improvement in that way. There's a lack of looking at the outcomes, so they never know what the efficacy of the treatment is beyond a very limited experience. And in cancer, for example, most GPs only see relatively few cancers of any one type each year. And the worst barrier of all is a lack of motivation to change. So whatever the motivation for going into medicine was, it hasn't been maintained. Then there are the guideline-related factors. If you've done guidelines, the biggest problems you have is where there simply is a lack of evidence, and you've got to at least try and reach a consensus, although that's a low level of evidence, and that can be very difficult. And it's quite amazing how many areas that we have in medicine that have been practiced the same way for decades, where there's very little evidence for that practice, and it's never been created. So you come across that quite often. The recommendation of a guideline has to have a validity. It has to be plausible, even in the literature. I mean, there's a very interesting literature on bowel preparation before surgery, and the only randomised trial apparently shows it doesn't work, and yet nobody would not do it. So a guideline that says, oh, don't bother doing that, it doesn't sound plausible, and yet there's not sufficient evidence to really make a decision on that. Guidelines can be very complex. As diseases become complex, one of the real issues when you start off with guidelines is you've got to identify the major questions that you need to be addressed by the guidelines. And when you get a group of experts together, you invariably start off with 50 or 60 questions, and you've got to say, look, we've got about enough money, time and so on to do 15. Can you cut them down? And so some people are losing their favourite questions, but it does help you to focus on what the important areas of practice are, rather than an interest or a research interest. Sometimes guidelines can be difficult to access, particularly in the written format and printed format. They can focus on a single disease, where in clinical world you've got multi-system diseases, or indeed multiple diseases all at the same time. And I remember actually at a Guidelines International conference in San Francisco that a speaker that wanted to be provocative got up and said diabetes doesn't exist. I was talking about mature onset diabetes doesn't exist, and everyone thought, oh, he's mad, we'll go and have a sleep. But in fact what he was going on to say was most people that have mature onset diabetes have the same risk factors, so they've probably got a bit of cardiovascular disease, might have a bit of hypertension and so on, and hypercholesterolemia. So just treating the blood sugar is missing the point. And some guidelines will teach you how to treat the blood sugar without looking at the bigger picture. So it was a very interesting presentation, but I didn't think I'd start off with a phrase like that. I might have been thrown out. And there's a lack of clear goals sometimes for intervention. So, again, it's this measuring what are you hoping to achieve by an intervention that you have with patients. So we've had the physician factors, the guideline factors, then the external factors and the organisational constraints, the procedures in your hospital, the quality management or lack of it in your hospital, for example. The lack of resources, which can be workload resources. If everyone's flat out just coping with the workload, they can't implement new things easily. And then, of course, financial resources. If it costs money to implement something new, that'll be a barrier until you manage to get round that. There can be a lack of collaboration with everyone from administrators or between clinicians to get guidelines implemented. And then there can be situations where a local way of doing things is built up and almost become written on tablets of stone. And so the big wide world tells you something different, but everyone's comfortable in doing what they've already been doing. And the interesting thing is, I remember when we were first looking at adjuvant therapy in colorectal cancer, and the surgeons weren't really interested in giving chemotherapy to patients who'd just been treated for colorectal cancer that had Duke C, because they still believed it was the meticulous dissection that was making the difference, and that's how they believed it. And I thought, oh, well, look, we don't have to worry too much because some of the colorectal surgeons are ageing a bit and the younger guys will get the point. But what I failed to realise is the older guys mentor the younger guys who have the same opinion as the older guys. So just be careful of that. And then in terms of implementation strategies, there are the workflow things where you've got to try and remove the barriers, but it's not just a negative thing, it's actually positively advertising the guidelines, and you've got to promote them actively, and you've got to, if you like, have reminders that there's a new procedure or that there's a new way of doing things. So it's not just getting over people's biases. There's the communication strategies, and we'll look at them in a minute. There's the dissemination of guidelines, and I'll show you what we did at Cancer Council, where we actually took our written guidelines and developed a media wiki platform on which to do guidelines, where you could blog back and you could instantly update guidelines and you could disseminate them to anyone in the world with a keystroke, and that made an enormous difference. And then there's the educating and training of health professionals to include the latest on evidence-based guidelines, which is what should be included in continuous professional development packages. But there's also, and we've hinted at this, I suppose, in what I've said about local groups of people who practice in a certain way. There's the social interaction with opinion leaders. So there are people that, because of the work they've done, because of the results they've achieved, do become opinion leaders in various fields, and the opportunity to interact with them is one of the things that does convince clinicians that this is not something externally that they've read about in a journal. This is something that they should try and implement as well. Then there are, and I won't go into these, but there are various decision support tools available to clinician, and as Bridie said, identifying the tools you'll need is very important. There are the standardised orders for treatment that have to often be changed, and the guidelines have to be translated into clinical pathways, for example, that are written down, that are documented, so that the paper trail, if you like, is part of the implementation. But what I'm trying to really say is implementation involves a multifaceted approach. Just as we broke up the barriers into three major groups, the implementation will have to address each of those barriers. And so it's not just this is the way you implement, this is the ways you have to implement to get over each of the barriers. So, paper that was in Implementation Science in 2015, which reviewed 35 eligible papers, was looking at the question about implementation planning. And that what they actually wanted to do originally was to look at successful implementation strategies, but they couldn't find enough evidence about that, so it seems they've changed the paper. We can at least create a checklist for what you have to do to implement, and this is what this paper did. So it was after reviewing the literature on implementation, it created a checklist, and it included some principles. That the principles of implementation start when you start developing the guideline. You don't do the guideline and say, well, we've got a beautiful guideline, how do we implement it? You start at the beginning. Who's our target audience? How are we going to get to them? And so it becomes part of the ethos of the whole development of the guideline. And then you've got to have the implementation tools, and you've got to, as guidelines are iterative, you've got to have some version of version control so that people are using the latest guidelines and not ones later on. And then you've got to have a lot of options for dissemination. And so part of the strategies that they have in this planning was to form a team with the stakeholders. So if they're in it right at the beginning, they will be continuing to nudge you onto how to implement it. You assess the resources, you look at the barriers, as we've said. You consider sometimes in a complex guideline disseminating parts of the guideline, so not try and do the whole thing, because with increasing specialisation in cancer, for example, the radiation bit of the guideline isn't particularly relevant to the surgeon. I mean, they are when they look at it all, but they'll be concentrating on one bit. So target parts of the guideline instead of trying to do the whole thing. Develop your implementation plan, but the very important thing is to pilot test that plan, because an implementation plan may not work in your circumstances for a variety of reasons. So what are the tools we keep talking about in this? And these tools have to, as part of bringing them up during the guideline development process, it gives you an opportunity for the group of stakeholders who you've brought on board right at the beginning to give you feedback on them. And you might have to decide whether you're going to create your guidelines in different language versions, different formats. For example, clinicians these days are increasingly getting their information from mobile devices, so if you make it web-based and it's not responsive, then it's going to be very hard to access. Summaries of guidelines for time-poor people to use them. Consumer versions, if you need them, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Decision aids, e-tools that can be easily accessed, and teaching aids are part of the toolkit that you'll need for this process. And in terms of dissemination, I've just listed there, and I won't go into all of them, but they're everything. They're a website, they're the advertising using the mass media, their podcasts, their marketing, using traditional marketing techniques to market your product, which is the guideline, their educational meetings, conferences and the educational materials, using the opinion leaders, getting the special societies on board, continually having reminders in the system about the new way of doing things, and then rewarding that by building them into various accreditation processes. So that's the sort of package for this. So I just want to give you an example, just finish with a case study of an example. When I was at the Cancer Council, we had these incredibly, it used to take 5 years to produce a guideline. They were beautiful big books. They kept doors open beautifully, and they looked great on the bookshelf. But that's as far as they went. And by the time everyone had finished, they were exhausted. And it was the reason there was a 5-year gap, I think, wasn't because that was the ideal time between guidelines. It was when people had forgotten how exhausted they were from doing the previous ones. So, every 5 years they'd get done again. So what we decided to do, we knew that there were overall guidelines and then there were very specific things. And so, for example, in Australia in cancer, there's a national effort which actually has the various chemotherapy protocols. And so when we were developing guidelines at a macro level of when you use chemo or radiotherapy or surgery for various cancers, you want to be able to link it with the electronic things. And so if you use chemotherapy, here's the recipe for the guidelines that have been developed nationally. So if you develop an E-type guideline, you can link all sorts of things, and that was the advantage. And so on this wiki, we developed it, and we found that because you can never actually destroy anything on the web, all the past versions were available. So if somebody wanted to go back historically and see how treatments had changed, you could do that. But the upper version was also a version, it was layered, if you like. Now, that comes to the point about we're still having an argument about whether we need separate consumer guidelines, because when you layer things on a web, and you don't read the website linearly, you pick out what you want. If it's like a newspaper where you've got the headlines, the first paragraph that's a summary, and then the detail going down, a consumer may be quite comfortable with the headlines in the first paragraph and never have to be confused by all the stuff below. So maybe you don't need separate consumer guidelines if you construct an electronic guideline properly. Well, I'm not going into this because of time, but really the guideline process didn't change, forming the groups, finding the questions, doing the literature reviews and so on, but then you put them onto the wiki platform and you got feedback constantly and you were able to increase them. But in terms of implementation, and this is my last bit, we wanted to do something practical or test something practical about implementation. And Price Kerford at Harvard, he's a urologist. He was doing some work with what at that time was called spaced education. And it was for busy clinicians. So the way he did it was he'd have a case scenario and then he'd ask a series of multiple choice questions. So a busy clinician in 10 minutes at the end of the day could do one of these programs. And then he had a system where you'd feed back the wrong answers over several months or several weeks actually, and by the time they'd got all the answers right, he felt that the information was in there. And so we thought, well, what about if we based something which is now called Qstream on a guideline? What about if we wrote the scenarios? And so we did just that. And Kerford had shown in a randomized trial that the people that had done his Qstream program actually did change practice. And he used a very tough example, actually. He was trying to stop clinicians doing PSA testing on the over 70s where it's unlikely to make any difference to their outcome. And he managed to show that he had a difference between those that had gone through Qstream education and no longer ordered the test. So a pilot study, we happened to be writing lung cancer guidelines, so we used stage 4 lung cancer. We got 8 captive we used 8 scenarios to cover the guts of the guideline, and then we found 16 registrars who were persuaded by the consultants to be in the study. And without going into it, there's a short case scenario, a set of multiple choice questions, and that's what they were given. 2 questions every second day. Incorrectly answered questions were repeated in 6 days. Correctly answered were repeated in 10 days. And to retire a question, participants needed to get it right twice in a row. So that's the iterative nature of it. And in fact, then they got feedback. Is your answer right? If it isn't right, what's the right answer? So over a few weeks, you got that information in. And we also introduced a gaming component because the Americans had done it. We didn't think the Australians would like it very much, but we set up a league table so the registrars in a de-identified way could see who was coming first and so on. And they loved it, which we were surprised at. And 10 had completed the course. We actually evaluated and just to look at it, they actually liked doing it this way. How did they access it? Either a computer or on a smartphone or a mobile device, so you have to have it both. Did you complete it? Well, most of them completed most of it. Would you be happy to do it again? Yes. So in summary, we need to look at the barriers to implementation. We need to propose strategies, and our strategy was to link each recommendation to an education module and then use the module to make the guideline information part of their background knowledge on which they made the clinical decisions. We need to formally test the implementation strategy, but that would only be one strategy in a multifaceted approach to implementing guidelines.